Today we have folks from all over, from the U.S. and from Canada presenting, and we're going to present Hydre. So we have Robbie Coville from the Davey Institute. We have Emily Stephan from State University of New York and in Syracuse, and we have Camille Lefrancois from Diamond Head Consulting out in Vancouver, Canada. So we're excited about today's presentation and welcome you to the presentation today. So I'm going to turn this over to Robbie, who's going to start and carry the weight from there. Remember, if you have any questions, you type them in the bottom, and if you have a technical issue, just raise your hand up on the top menu bar, and I'll try to expedite whatever issue you have. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. So just pulling up the slides now. Can everyone see that all right? See that all right, Dave?
Yep, perfect.
Great. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us today. We got a good webinar lined up, and the overall outline of this will be myself presenting an overview of Hydre, some of the methods behind it, and the kind of ins and outs of it, inputs, outputs. Then Emily Stephan is going to walk us through the inputs step by step to help everyone become more comfortable getting their project all set up. And then to highlight some results and just overall project design, we've invited Camille Lefrancois to present a urban planning project that she used Hydre for as part of her master's, and some great presentation of results in there, and also just good use of the model to share with everyone, give some ideas about how this tool is being used. So with that being said, we'll get started, and we'll start at just the context of Hydre and where this fits in. So this is for stormwater management specifically, in a suite of tools that's focused on urban forestry and the benefits of trees. And so the need for the model and management, especially with hydrology, is because of how complex, how many factors are at play. The model can create a really simple way to look at complex relationships. Hydre especially is serving as a first order model where it's enabling us to do very rapid assessments of pretty major projects, changes in land cover, how that's going to affect our water resources.
Robbie, this is Dave. Sorry to interrupt, but are you going to switch over to slideshow? Because we have your dialog boxes in the bottom right corner is blocking us. If you could just move that, that would be perfect.
Oh, yeah. Let me see.
There you go. Okay, thank you.
Better?
Yep, perfect.
Thanks.
Sorry to interrupt.
So I'm focusing in more on Hydre as a hydrology model. Again, this is a first order model helping us make decisions based on how tree cover, impervious cover, and other land cover types changes to that, how it affects stream flow and water quality. And so this model is originating from Dr. Ted Endreny of SUNY ESF here in Syracuse and Dr. Dave Nowak from the Forest Service, who's leading the iTree project. And it's designed to fill the niche of a first-order hydrology model, something that's a rapid tool when you have a project or a situation you want to get a good scientific look at. You can turn to these first-order tools to do that very easily, very low cost, without a lot of expertise needed. And right now, many first-order hydrology models are based on a rational method, and so this model is more advanced than that, but we still try to keep it very easy to use, very flexible to use, so that it can serve a wide range of purposes, taking that first look at how land cover will impact water. So this type of model, it's a rainfall runoff model. It's also another way to think of this as a mechanistic model where we're trying to simulate the mechanisms at play in hydrology. So rather than just taking an empirical relationship like some of these rational method models, we have routines and algorithms built in to simulate infiltration, evapotranspiration, many different processes that I'll highlight in the next slide as well. But overall, the idea is transforming rainfall into runoff and looking at all the different factors in between there to explore how that's happening, specifically with vegetation processes. And then the outputs, we're looking at overall the stream flow or channel flow, and also runoff partitioning. So how is our rainfall going to move through our system, our project area, to get into stream flow or our outlet? So there's subsurface flow or base flow, and then overland pervious flow and impervious flow. So different types of projects, different users are going to be interested in different things. In general, people are often interested in overland runoff, and that can be impervious and pervious. And so again, this is the first level of analysis, and I'm going to move through some of the method slides a little quickly. So hope I don't scare anyone away with that, but just want to make sure we have time to get to the example project later on and the step-by-step walkthrough. But so, again, on this slide, it's highlighting many things already went over, just that it's this first order approximation, looking at changes in tree cover, land cover types, how that's affecting stream flow and water quality. So here's highlighting some of the model processes at play. And again, a lot going on here, but just to keep it simple and let you take a look at it if you want to revisit this later in the recording, showing these many different mechanisms at play that affect how rainfall turns into runoff. And in our simulations, we're going to adjust or impact some of these processes, and that's what the model's really useful for. So looking at, how is impervious runoff, number 4, going to be affected by increases in impervious cover from a development project or something along those lines. So looking at the outputs, the main ones, again, are that surface and subsurface flow and water quality, which is based on the surface runoffs. We also have these intermediary outputs, which are, we're working on making those more accessible for users right in the model. More on that later on. So looking at land cover, we're capturing bare soil, shrub, and grass and herbaceous cover, impervious surfaces, and then tree cover over that impervious area and tree cover over pervious area. We simulate the effects of those cover types. We have some canopy properties to help describe the tree cover, the shrub and herbaceous vegetation as well. And that's through leaf area indexes and leaf transition periods. Then we're modeling interception, depression storage. Again, I'm just going to fly through some of these that are pretty technical, put them on the screen so you can revisit them later if you'd like, but don't want to go too into detail right now. And looking at surface runoff, which is a function of a lot of these different processes, that depression storage and infiltration, soil moisture. Big part of Hydre and what makes it unique is our vegetation processes, especially for first order models, but even in general for hydrological modeling. We try to make sure that we're capturing the effects of trees and shrubs and green space well. We're developing in green infrastructure as well, so that the model can serve for users who are interested in incorporating more green space into a project, look at how that's going to affect the project, or how will the loss of green space have an impact on the project area. And so this slide is just highlighting some of those processes related to vegetation, some more processes on subsurface and stream flow, and calibration is another key part of the model. So for a first order model, we do want to make it easy to use and flexible, but we also want to make it so users who want a more accurate, more localized simulation can easily accomplish that. To do so, we've incorporated some auto-calibration algorithms. And this is taking stream flow observations from a stream gauge and the weather data input for the project, and then trying to match the predicted flows based on all your other inputs to that observed flow. With a good calibration, we can then have that much better of an idea or better confidence in the alternative case simulations. So now when we predict something for inputs that don't exist yet, new land cover types, we can kind of compare how will that relate, how did our base case prediction relate to our actual observed data. And here we highlight some of those model calibration results. In this graph, it's showing in green the prediction from the model, and in black the observed stream flow. Now, this process isn't always perfect. Sometimes the weather data and the observed stream flow don't come from the same place, and that can make it hard for the model to match its predictions. But it does definitely help develop a set of complex hydrological parameters that meet your local project area pretty well. So then moving on to the outputs, again, we're looking at water quantity in terms of stream flow and its components, and then we're looking at water quality. So here is some of the formats of water quantity. We have that calibration comparison, as you saw, with predicted and observed stream flow. We have the yearly, monthly, and daily bar graphs, and that's, you can see on the left here, the monthly form. And then we have an hourly time series, and this is a zoom in of just a few hours on a single day of the project. And you can export that time series as a table, and then you can manipulate those outputs and present them as you'd like. I'll show a few examples of that, and then you'll see that so in Camille's project. And then for water quality, you'll see the same types of outputs as we had before. Just to jump back to those, the bar graph and the time series. And that's all based on the surface flows, so it's pervious and impervious runoff being multiplied by a pollutant coefficient, in this case, nationwide average event mean concentration values, in order to calculate a pollutant load. And this method is a simplification. Again, we want to make sure this model is quick and easy to use, so it is a trade-off versus capturing those detailed spatial relationships between pollutant contribution and buffering versus just making sure we can get the model up and running pretty quickly. So event mean concentration is a pretty widely accepted way to simplify those complex water quality processes. We're actually making a lot of progress on this front to localize those EMC values rather than just have a national average. For one, users will soon be able to edit those on their own if they have local values. And then we'll also be introducing some localized values based on the watershed that your project is in. But more on that to come. And just looking at some of the exported outputs. So top left, some of you might recognize this table from the previous iTree Hydro webinar. Our guest speaker then, Eric Kuehler, shared this as part of a project that he did. And then here are just a few other outputs to give you an idea of what this model could be used for. On the right, we're looking at the percent change of a few different scenarios compared to the initial conditions. So these two different developments, or a development scenario, a land reclamation scenario, and then a targeted 2.5% canopy gain. And then on the bottom left is an example of how the Forest Service uses iTree Hydro in some of its environmental benefit reports, urban forestry reports. It's looking at how scaling tree cover and impervious cover affects your annual flows. Of course, some of those extreme values are not realistic, but it's just to show a general trend of what that pattern of land cover impacts will be. And so we're running projects like that and comparing these graphs to see how they differ from watershed to watershed. And now I'll pass it off to Emily, who will walk us step by step through the iTree Hydro model inputs.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. I just want to give you an idea of what Hydro will look like when you hopefully download it, so you can see some of the steps, and I can talk about where some of the inputs come from and how we've sort of streamlined that process to make it easier as a first order model using nationally available data. So the model interface looks like this when you open it. There's a bit of information about what Hydro is and kind of generally what it uses to be able to predict water quality and quantity. So you can either open up a new project through File or start a new project, open up an existing project, and then you see on the top bar there are steps. So I will go into step 1. Step 1 is general project area information, and the first thing you need to input is the topographic information for your watershed or study area. So you can see you have the options of including either a DEM file or a topographic index file. And I'll go through what those are on this slide. Some of you might be familiar with a digital elevation model. That's a model basically of the elevation of your study site processed through ArcGIS. So a lot of you may have used these before. And if you haven't, we have an option for you as well. The first thing that Hydre does in processing the DEM is converts it into a topographic index file. So on the right, we see bins of a topographic index generated from this DEM that we have. And this basically organizes your whole watershed into bins of topographic similarity. So each bin has cells that are of the same topographic index. That's basically a wetness index. And those cells behave similarly so that the model has to do only 30 simulations and each cell within the bin behaves similarly rather than doing a water balance for the whole watershed. So Robbie mentioned earlier that Hydre is a statistically distributed model, and so that's where that comes from. So if you're able to create a DEM, you can do that, or you can pick one of the topographic index files that's already processed within Hydre. So when you pick that topographic index option in step 1, you can have the option of using an existing watershed or census designated place that we have preloaded for you. So your next step is to define your project location. This allows you to determine properties of the trees, so when they lose their leaves and things like that, as well as centers your maps for weather and stream flow data, which I will show you later. And then basic watershed characteristics. Within this first menu, you have to know your land area and your tree cover percentage. And this is the only land cover input you need at this point, but that is critical in processing the weather data. So that's why we need tree cover in this step. We also have leaf area index, as Robbie mentioned earlier, and the percent evergreen tree and shrub cover. This just allows the model to process the weather based on which trees are going to lose their leaves and which will not. Then we have start date and end date, so the time period of your simulation. We have 2005 to 2012 preloaded for these observed stream flow and weather data. But if you want a time period outside of those ranges, you can also load your own data. And just to give you an idea of how we understand land cover for Hydre, since iTree Hydre is so focused on trees, we're very interested not only in the tree canopy, but what's below the tree canopy. So a lot of you might be familiar with NLCD, the National Land Cover Database. That gives you a rough idea of, on a 30 by 30 meter pixel, what the land cover is. However, that won't give you a layer of canopy over pervious or impervious surface, which is an important distinction within the model. So we use iTree Canopy, which is a standalone tool available online at the iTree Tools website, which allows you to input a shapefile of your study area and do photo interpretation of randomized points within that watershed. So as you can see here, this crosshatch in the middle is on a road, so we're going to identify that as an impervious road. So we have some guidance on the iTree Tools website to further help you set up a canopy project and hopefully get more accurate land cover input results. Our next step is to get both the weather and calibration or stream flow data. So since we've put in our location, in this case it's Syracuse, when we want to select a weather station from the map, that map opens up and shows us which options we have near our study site of Syracuse. Similar thing happens with the calibration data or stream flow data. If you want to be able to calibrate to an existing stream flow data set, you can pick a USGS gauge from the map, or you can feed in a raw or processed data file. There's more guidance on how to do that on the iTree Tools website. Alternatively, if you don't have existing stream flow data, you can just say not calibrating and it won't have an observed record to compare to. But that's okay for something like a municipal area where you don't have a single outlet point within your area. that stream data often comes from the USGS. These are some sites, and this qops.dat text file is what the processed streamflow data file looks like. But you can also, if you have your own data, you can process it in the same way. And this is what weather data looks like. Again, we're pulling from the NCDC website for our map and screening those to make sure we have accurate and full data sets. But if you have your own weather data, there are ways to process that as well. Step 2 is more advanced land cover parameters. So first, you want to look at the surface cover types. We've already put in tree cover in step 1, so that is grayed out and has been set already. Then we have to fill in the rest of these with shrub cover, herbaceous cover, water cover, impervious, and soil cover to add up to 100%. And that is from iTree Canopy Survey. Next, you want to look at the cover types beneath tree cover. I mentioned that's one big advantage of using canopy is you can tell not only where the tree canopy covers, but what is beneath that cover. And that's going to affect that conversion of rainfall to runoff, as Robbie was mentioning. So not only do we need to know the tree cover, but we indicate of that tree cover what percentage is covering pervious and impervious cover. We also have options for inputting tree, shrub, and herbaceous leaf area index. These default to the values you see here, but you are free to change them if you know otherwise. And another important parameter is directly connected impervious cover. This is essentially saying of your impervious cover, how much of it is directly connected to some sort of outlet. And we obtain this value through equations, which are in the help text. If you hover into this directly connected impervious cover area, you can get some guidance on the equations we use based on the density of your area to determine what the percentage of impervious cover that is directly connected is within your watershed or study area. Step 3 is called hydrological parameters. This is the parameter set Robbie was talking about calibrating earlier. Essentially, we are able to retain different parameter sets based on fits and what we would like to use them for. So we have options to retain or delete parameter sets. This third radio button gives us the option of auto-calibrating a parameter set. And essentially, that would go through an auto-calibration algorithm to determine what the best parameters are to fit our observed data set. So you're not able to do this if you don't have an observed data set for your stream flow. So some of the parameters, a lot of these are soil parameters, things that get calibrated. So we have average annual flow at gauging station. We have some soil type parameters. And then we have these advanced settings over here. Typically, they're grayed out unless the user really wants to adjust them. Some of these are not calibrated. So leaf transition period and leaf on and leaf off day are based on your location. So it looks at when during the year leaves come on and off your trees that are not evergreen trees. We also store our leaf area index values here. But a lot of these parameters at the bottom are scaling parameters or different soil type parameters, which would then be calibrated. And finally, step 4. So prior to this, you were looking at the existing land cover and how that is affecting water quality and quantity. But if you're looking at a project, maybe you have alternative cases to consider. So we allow you the option of defining an alternative case with different land cover and directly connected impervious cover parameters. So you can either model a proposed project or just look at a potential development or greening scenario and how that would ultimately affect water quality and quantity. So this looks the same as step 2, except you have an alternative case. And finally, step 5 in the drop-down menu is just to run the model. And hopefully everything will go well and you will get this screen, which just says model run complete, which then generates the outputs that Robbie was discussing. So now that you've seen sort of the insides of what Hydre looks like, I'm going to turn it over to Camille and have her demonstrate what she did for her master's project in Vancouver for her urban planning degree. And thank you for paying attention.
All right, hi there. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, sound good. I'll pass that over to you.
Hi there, my name is Camille Lefrancois and I work with Diamond Head Consulting in Vancouver, Canada. So today I'm just going to present to you a project that I realized last year. This was my master's project for my master's in urban planning, as well as an internship with Diamond Head Consulting. The project is entitled Designing Effective Stormwater Management Policy, the Role of the Urban Forest and Impervious Cover in Vancouver, British Columbia. And this project came about when we were brainstorming with the staff here at Head, who does a lot of projects related to urban forestry with municipal government, and they were really interested in understanding better some of the benefits related to the urban forest so that they can make the case for planning for it at municipal level. And stormwater management was one that they felt like they didn't quite understand, and so that what got us started on this project. And I started with the idea of really trying to test out different stormwater management models and find out how I could get more arguments for the urban forest in terms of the stormwater management benefits. And so what I'll present to you through the presentation here is basically, I won't go into too many details in terms of all of the content, because I think you can definitely go and find my project online. Would you like to find out more about the specifics of my findings? So what I'm hoping you get from this presentation is rather just a sense of what it took to realize the project, and in terms of the practical aspect of how you might go about starting your own project, because that's one thing that I didn't find to be widely available as I started doing this research myself. So first, I'll just give you an overview of the model input and what my project really was. So as I mentioned before, I worked from Vancouver, Canada, so we're just around the border between Canada and the United States on the Pacific side. And the case study area I decided to choose for this project is a small sewer shed in a single-family residential area in Vancouver. So this is a pretty typical type of neighborhood for Vancouver, where you have fairly narrow lots and single-family houses with lots of garages. In this part of the city, the tree canopy is fairly young, so as you can see, we don't have that much canopy cover, at least in terms of the street trees. And so that's the area we set to take a look at using Hydre. In terms of getting the surface cover, I know that Robbie mentioned it's a great option to use iTree Canopy. In our case, partly because this was a research project, and partly because we were just interested in finding out new methods to get the surface cover, as well as to be able to get the files for mapping, so the shape files. We used mostly some of the city's LiDAR data set to get a breakdown of the different surface cover types, mostly in terms of the buildings and the shrub layer. And then some photo interpretation, because it was a fairly small area to split between different surfaces, as you can see on the picture. My analysis itself was broken down into two parts. So the first part of the analysis was around sensitivity testing. And what I wanted to do is basically to look at incremental changes in some of the model parameters to really understand how it worked in the context of our climate here. Most importantly, of course, canopy cover and impervious versus pervious cover. So basically varying the surface cover from 0 to 100% in small increments to get a sense of the magnitude of change in surface runoff from those changes. The second part of my analysis was more realistic in terms of the urban planning scenarios that I brought forward. And that was really in terms of trying to understand what the current changes happening in Vancouver are doing to our water balance, and a sense of what future policy we might implement and what that might do for the area. So I started looking at pre-development scenarios, basically looking at the area when it was forested naturally and clear-cut. And then I compared that with our current neighborhood and some business as usual scenarios. So currently in Vancouver, there is a trend for infill development. I looked at what the impact of that would be for this area, as well as the young trees maturing. And finally, I look at a couple green infrastructure scenarios. So one of them being the country lanes, looking at basically green lanes that are made for water infiltration that we implemented in Vancouver, as well as downspout disconnection for the rooftops. What it gave in terms of the surface cover that I elaborated for each of those scenarios, I really want to spend a minute showing you what the kind of numbers I use are. Basically, the reason for this is if you're about to set your own project through Hydro and you want to model future scenarios in a fairly realistic way, I would really recommend that you spend some time before you go to iTree Canopy or whatever other method you think you'll use to get your surface cover, really to think about what parameters you might need. Because in my case, I needed more than just the impervious cover and what was directly connected. Not because the model asks for it, but in order to be able to figure out what they were in a realistic way for my neighborhood as I implemented the infill development and all of that. And so I really needed for my scenarios to have the houses and separate that from the garages and from the street pavements and so forth. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're about to set up your own iTree project. In terms of the output, so I'm just going to show you quickly what it looked for me and how I analyze my data, because I think that's one of the great strengths of iTree Hydro, is how it enables you to really go about making your own data analysis. So beyond what the quick PDF and graphs that iTree produces, it allows you to export everything into Excel. And so that's what I did because I wanted to compare a wide variety of scenarios. And what you can see here is just a screenshot of some of the spreadsheets I had where I could compare all the types of flow components. Hourly did the same for the annual, the monthly outputs, and highlighting some of the months where my canopy cover had leaves on and so forth, so I could really get all the graphs that I wanted. So I think that's really something that's great about this model. In terms of the results themselves, so the first part of my analysis I told you about was to look at sensitivity testing and comparing what different surface cover changes due to my surface runoff. And so what you see here is a graph of changes in canopy cover. So basically, and this is obviously not a realistic thing, but I took my canopy cover and brought it from 0 to 100% of my case study area. And what you can see is that it changes approximately 10% in terms of the surface runoff. And when I compared that to changes in impervious and pervious cover, you can really see here with this graph that the rate of change is much, much greater. And so in fact, it's about 11 times as important, which was a big finding for us, because in a way we expected to find more of a difference from changes in canopy cover than what we did. So we had to reframe a little bit how we went about approaching the research itself in a context of urban forestry and trying to understand its benefits. So that was one part. And then in terms of the results for my urban plan areas, I'll show you a couple of the graphs that I produced. There's a couple more in the report itself, which you can find the link on the iTree resource section of the website. But basically, this is an overview graph looking at the annual flow changes broken down by components for each of the scenarios I outlined before. So when you look at the pre-development scenarios, you can really see that base flow is what is leading the annual flow in the area. And when we get to the current situation, we really have a switch where surface flow becomes the dominant component. And in each of those scenarios, you can see the slight variations and where we get the most difference in terms of overall reduction in surface flow. For instance, the rooftop disconnection, so the two scenarios on the far right are really the ones that make most of the difference, and that's because directly connected impervious area is changing, of course. Now, in terms of the same scenarios, I also looked at the mean annual pollutant loads. So seeing those changes, which are quite closely linked, as was mentioned, to the surface flow, so surface runoff. And then I went into some more details. As I showed you my spreadsheet, I started looking at things like single event peak flow. So on the graph you can see on the left here, I was looking at two of my scenarios, so the infill development and the current scenario for one single event of rainfall, and how the peak flow had changed between those two. It was quite interesting, the ability to go and pick your own interesting events and display that as an example. And I did this similar analysis for the monthly surface runoff, so looking at, in this case, the current, the scenarios for the green infrastructure and how the rooftop disconnection is really making the most of the difference. And you can see, of course, with the bar graph showing at the back how closely correlated surface runoff is with the area rainfall. So yeah, and it basically, model really enabled me to go in depth into really understanding where the important changes should come from in terms of having more effective stormwater management policy in the context of Vancouver and our local climate. In terms of the report finding, as I mentioned earlier, when we set out to do this research, we were really expecting, in a way, to find an easy case for urban forests canopy and how that changes surface runoff. And in this case, we found that the impact was perhaps not as important as we thought it was. And so for us, that was a bit of a need to reframe the approach and focus on the soil first and how we can get to the trees from there. So that was something that we had to struggle with a little bit, but in the end, I think it makes a lot of sense, and intuitively as well. And of course, that will vary a lot in the case of Vancouver, because our climate is so wet in the winter and most of our urban trees are deciduous. Obviously, we don't get as much interception, so there's factors like this that are influential. But beyond what the report findings themselves were, in terms of the experience using Hydre, as I mentioned before, I think the thing I appreciated the most about the model is how transparent it is. You can really go through your data and edit graphs or whatever part of the analysis you might find the most interesting yourself. So that's really great, and the level of details is something we didn't find in any other models. And you might have noticed I mentioned in the introduction that when I started my project, I wanted to look at a couple stormwater management models, and I did, but in the end I really ended up focusing a lot with on Hydre, just because of the capabilities and the level of details it has. And just as a final comment, in terms of what we hope we can get in the future from Hydre, I think for us, having more capabilities on the green infrastructure side, the more engineered side of the urban forestry will be something that will be very helpful. But overall, we had a great experience using Hydre. So once more, this is my report, so Designing Effective Stormwater Management Policy. You can find it on the Hydre Tools resource page on the website. And thank you very much for tuning in. Again, my name is Camille Lefrancois with Diamond Head Consulting, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions on this project. Thank you.
All that said, I'll wrap up, show some online resources here. Just the support forum, which has a lot of FAQs, our tech support email you can reach me and others at. And we have an upcoming workshop in just a few days now, but if you're going to WEFTEC and you're available, it's on Sunday. That'll be a great hands-on workshop focusing on version 6 with green infrastructure and the ability to edit EMCs, some of those new features, help people get familiar with all that. And lastly, you can subscribe to the iTree newsletter for updates about Hydre and other tools at this link here. And so from there, I'll see if we have any questions. I'll pass it back to Dave.
If anyone had any questions that they typed in, you could go ahead now for any of the team members that, for Robbie, Emily, or as we go through. But if not, what I wanted to just do one quick thing here, because folks have gotten a little confused sometimes on trying to figure out how to find where the CEUs are. So if you go to itree.unread.org/CEU, it'll take you to this page here, and today's quiz is right there. So if you've had trouble accessing that, if you go to CEU, I have all the quizzes for this whole year. So if you do need ISA or SAF credits, you can always go watch the replays and then go ahead and take the quiz there. The other thing I'd show you, I do have on here, if you go to webcasts and you just click on the webcast archives, it'll take you to the instructional workshop series, and all of our archived webcasts are there. So today's webcast is there. You clicked on the date, and here it is. It gives you a little overview. I got Robbie and Emily and Camille's information. The link to the CEU credits. There's web links in here for Camille's company as well as the Davey Institute. And then I have some, Camille's article is in here too. And then you're just going to click on the video here and you'll be able to replay of this if you want to look at that again. So what I hope to do is meet with Camille and record her session over again. I'll interlink that in, and hopefully by tomorrow or Thursday, I'm going to post the video with the audio difficulties this afternoon, but after that we'll have the full video so that you could use this, replay it to an audience, or use it in your own presentations. So I just wanted to point that out to you and let you know that. So from there, Robbie, do you have anything else to add? I'd like to, the last thing I would say is we'd like to have you join us for our upcoming next webcasts. In October is going to be on, I don't have the link right here, but the October will be iTree Canopy as well as iTree Design. So there's been a couple enhancements in there that you might be looking for, and we will send out an email to everybody so you can pre-register for that in the next day or so. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Forest Service and the folks at Davey and the entire team here for joining us on today's webcast. We'll see you in October, and we'll be presenting iTree Canopy and iTree Design. So thank you very much.